Yo, my people, what's up? Welcome back to Shelf Stories, the channel that tells tales from games, books, and life. And welcome to the One Stop Co-op Shop podcast. I am your host, Jason. Thank you so much for stopping by for this latest game feature. We are in the middle of, well, I am, Jason is, in the middle of featuring a very exciting Kickstarter project for me. This podcast is going along with a designer playthrough, a designer commentary playthrough that will be on the One Stop Co-op Shop YouTube channel as well. Very excited about this. So we're getting 360-degree coverage for this relaunch. Third edition, Block by Bloc Uprising. It is a cooperative game for 1 to 4 players about resisting in an urban setting, the peoples rise up, all that kind of thing. But I will let one of the co-designers describe it for you. He did not design the original edition, but came in and led his expertise, and you can definitely tell the level of craft in the third edition. Major changes have been done to make this the best product possible. He is Greg Loring-Albright. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jason. It's so good to be here. Sorry.
No, yeah. I mean, we did the designer playthrough. That's a tandem piece to this. So this will be a little bit shorter. We're not going to cover as much ground. I'm not going to talk as much about the changes because we go over that in the playthrough. But we should tell the people what this is before we get into some of the more kind of above the like big picture. I guess I should say big picture stuff of the game. So let's tell them about it. Block by Bloc Uprising, third edition. Tell them all about it. Give them the pitch.
Yeah. So this is Block by Bloc Uprising. As you've said, it's the third edition of Block by Bloc, which is a game that's been out. The first edition was in 2016. The second edition was in 2018. Those were the projects of TL Simons and Out of Order Games. And TL's a friend of mine and brought me on to co-design Uprising, the third edition. So TL wasn't able to join us today, but says hello. And I'm here to talk about the game. And it's going to GameFound on February 15th. As Jason said, 1 to 4 players. 1 and 2, it plays in about an hour. At 3 to 4, it's a little longer. It can go 2 to even 3 hours on your first time through. But it's a co-op and semi-co-op game about a people's movement, about protests in the streets, about social uprising, about liberating the city from the oppressive state.
And it's not about like any particular uprising. Like it's not like modeling the environmental process, not modeling police brutality. It's not like all these kind of like tangible social issues that we could have made, that could have been the game. It's just like general, the people are taking the streets back from the state.
Yeah, it's right? Intentionally abstracted, both in terms of like, there's not within the game any sense of like, oh, this is why the protest started. This is why the people are marching. It sort of picks up in medias res and it's like, okay, we're on the streets. And similarly, it's not set in any real world city. The districts have evocative names. There's, the gentrifying residential zone, the privatized university, but it's not like, University City in West Philadelphia. It's just sort of a city. And so that abstraction gives you some purchase as the player. You can imagine more of a story than if we were kind of mapping our own story onto it too hard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the people like mechanisms, and again, watch the playthrough if you want to see mechanisms, but give us those, like how does this game work? What am I getting when I have the mechanical experience at the table with Block by Bloc?
Totally. So it's a dice placement action selection game. So on your turn, you're going to roll a bunch of dice, and the number of dice you roll is determined by the strength of your movement, by how many blocks, how many people you have in the street. So you'll get more as the game goes on. You'll build your power. You'll build a bigger movement. You use those dice to take actions, the simple actions like moving around the city and building barricades. You can take with any die, but there are places in the city. Each district has a number on it, and you need to use a die of that value or greater to take that action. So there's some texture to the board, to the gameplay. You have to decide, should I use my 6 for this easy action, or should I save it for using this big, attack or building my occupation to liberate the city? So that's the sort of what the players are doing. The opponents are the police. They're run by 2 decks of cards. That's sort of a pseudo pandemic style, right? As with a lot of co-op games, there's a card deck that drives this cardboard AI. There's a countdown. So if you don't liberate the city in time, you lose. And yeah, that's how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you're playing these cubes basically. So like you did the blocks. So you don't have like one avatar. You're like you're governing this like movement, like so you can have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they move around the city pretty freely, and they have to, you're going to have goals. So like, you have to, conquer this territory, which is like one tile on the area. So it's like, okay, well, not conquer, but liberate.
Yes, that's right.
They're trying to conquer. We're trying to liberate. It's the same thing mechanically. Claim that area. So there's a little bit of like area control here. So you're using your dice drive your actions, and you're trying to kind of, conquer area. And then the police have an AI deck that is designed to go after those areas. And so there's like conflict. So you are going to get into conflict with the police. It's going to be very abstracted. We're not going to, we're not all about that. We just want to like simulate the clash.
That's right.
Between the state and the peoples.
And the area control aspect also comes up in the semi-co-op version, which, the game includes both versions. It's great at both. We recommend playing the cooperative to learn the game, but the semi-co-op definitely brings a sort of social tension. There's a little bit of deduction, but yeah, there's some area control there, as well as different factions might have individual non-social goals. They're trying to hijack the revolution for their own ends, and they'll need to control certain parts of the city. So in addition to, liberating and pushing back the police and building barricades to keep them on their side of the city, you might start to worry if one of your fellow players is like, I'm putting all my blocks into this district. Just no reason, don't worry about it. And then suddenly you're like, maybe I should try and outnumber them there just in case. So yeah,
so
there are multiple ways to play.
They're not undercover police. They're not like COINTELPRO or something like that.
Yeah, we thought about that, but we wanted the game, even in this sort of conflictual mode, to not represent that sort of like grim, dark aspect of organizing. Even at its most cynical, the game doesn't have anyone who's like an FBI insider or whatever. It's just these dynamics that are real in organizing movements of people with different goals, kind of butting heads a little bit.
Right. Anyone who knows the history of social movements, which of course, if anyone watches Shelf Stories, that's why you reached out to me. You're like, this is the guy.
100%. We're so glad you were able to fit us in.
History, social protest, that kind of thing. Anyone who knows that not like all social protests have splinters. Every single one that of any size, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, it's like, okay, what do we do this or do we do that? So the semi co-op sounds like it's just like, okay, you're still, a protester of the person, but you just feel like we should do it this way, not that way, and strong personalities butting heads and all that kind of thing. So it's more of it's not as like, as you were saying, kind of sinister.
Yes, correct. We want people to have a good time, even though this game is about something, real and serious and thought-provoking. It is a game first. It's a fun activity to do with your friends first and foremost.
Right. So in terms of the development from the editions, right? So like first edition, second edition, Greg come on to help out with the third edition. Once again, there are a lot of mechanical differences that we go through in the playthrough. Yes, I've said that phrase many times. Watch both products if you want to really get the 360. So we go through, where changes were made, rationales, like, okay, this felt different than this and that kind of thing. There's one mechanism that I did not put in the playthrough, but it's best left forgotten.
It's a little Easter egg for people who've played the earlier editions. You'll notice
Exactly.
what's missing, and you'll love it.
There's one mechanism. It's like, okay, bon voyage, but we didn't talk about that. The other ones we did. But I wanted to have do this with a podcast because I am so interested in this theme. I am so interested in your background, Greg, and TL's background, and because there's nothing like this in the board gaming, nothing. I like to think of it like, you've seen my show. It's all about like, gaming is about colonization, and gaming is about like, kind of playing the boss. It's almost like, in our little bubble, it's like we love playing the empire. We hate playing the rebels. When you're playing a colonizer, you're playing the empire. When you're playing, a manager of this thing, and you're trying to like do like you're playing the empire, people. And I can't get that. It's like play the peoples. And so
I feel that.
And so here you completely flipped it on its head in a way that hasn't been done before. So just on a just a beginner level, talk about what inspired, you, because you've spoken with TL a bunch, and what inspired, both of you to really lean into this theme just at the very start.
Yeah, totally. So again, I'm speaking for TL here, who, designed this project. I've been a fan of this game since the first edition. My partner found it on Kickstarter, and I backed it and played it ever since edition 1. But I've talked to TL a whole bunch about the ideas behind it. So I'm hopefully not putting too many false words in their mouth. But basically, this idea that TL and Rocket had was exactly this of like, there are plenty of games sort of provide an imaginary for you to adopt, right? They provide a position for you as the player to take and imagine yourself in. And not all games, there are abstracts where it's just sort of like we're moving pieces and engaging with the puzzle. But a lot of games say you are this.
Abstracts like chess. You're a general.
Yeah, you're sort of the commander. Yeah.
You're the commander. Like checkers, you're the general. Go is called the surrounding game.
Yes,
it's a verb, and like, okay, you're surrounding like a general or like a boss. So then even the most abstract games have that have that DNA in it. So like, that makes it especially interesting that you've subverted, what is very, very old coding and gaming.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to do structurally, right? Because it's like in a game, one of the things that makes games fun and engaging is, making hard choices, weighing options against one another. And that's often a position of power. If you're able to make a choice that has a real impact, you are a person in a position of power. So it makes sense to me that games often simulate, managers, generals, heads of state, etc. But TL and Rocket saw this and they were like, this is kind of a problem, because if the only place we as people who like board games can imagine ourselves is with the powerful, we're never going to be able to embrace the struggles of the people who don't have power. And so that was sort of part of the genesis of Block by Block around the time, the first edition was published in 2016, but I know TL and Rocket were working on it in 2010 and 2011 and starting to brainstorm it. And that was, the height of Occupy, the movement of the squares, the Arab Spring. And so all these global movements, the student nurses, I don't remember, in Chiapas and Oaxaca, big global protest movements were happening in the early 2010s. And that's really woven into the DNA of Block by Block.
It's funny, it's social media driven. Like, that was the big promise. Like social media had been born in the 2000s, right? And then in the 2000s, we were like, going on message boards and whatever. And then there was this very kind of short window relatively to the history, 2010, 2009, 2010, 2011. The financial crash had also hit, in 2008. So there's a lot of discontent in the world. And so like you get all this discontent, you get nobody going to jail for all that, all the stuff that happened. Like not a single Wall Street tycoon even sniffed the jail, where if I did something like that, I'd be in jail forever.
Right.
And then you have social media where we can talk, across, like someone in, Egypt can talk to people in New York and universities all over the world and, like share knowledge and share theory and all that kind of stuff. And so you had this like moment of uprising, Occupy, you mentioned. And, it was coming off of the, it's not like protest was invented in the 2010s. Like you've had protests the entire time. Like, like when I was in college, it was about the Seattle WTO.
Sure,
the
battle for Seattle. All that.
I wasn't like there. I wish I was, but like, following it and like, being interested in it and being like kind of turned on to this life at that point. So there's always been that. But like in the 2010s, there was this huge uprising. And, eventually we became to fall in love with our, algorithmically enhanced advertising. And we kind of like, all went back to sleep and, back in the matrix, so to speak. But, it sounds like, it, at least the spark of it entered this game.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned the battle for Seattle, because there's actually a sort of precursor. I don't know if TL has played this game. I haven't. And sorry, I don't know if you can see my colors reflecting on my screen. I'm going to BGG to make sure I have the title right. It's called Battle of Seattle, and it's a war game about that protest. It's a little more squarely in the war game camp, where there's like operations and logistics, and that's not a genre I'm super familiar with. Whereas Block by Block is much more, it's war game adjacent. You need to care about territory, you need to move little cubes around. It's fairly abstract, but it's much more in the board gaming space.
It's a cooperative game. Like, I mean, for anyone 100%. Who is like, who's played the Burgle Brothers and the Pandemics and the, like classic cooperative play. This is a classic one. It's a little bit more involved, a little bit longer. Like, I mean, the board is big. It's like, this big kind of 5x5, 25 squares. And there's a lot of planning that goes in. So it's like, it's not this easy breezy, exactly pandemic type, but the guts are there.
Totally.
And,
if you play the Pandemic, you can handle, it's like a step up in terms of complexity, but you'll be able to handle Block by Block for sure.
Where in a war game is like a very different
yes. Correct.
because troop positioning matters and all this other stuff matters.
Results tables and all that stuff.
Yeah. So a little bit edging towards that wargaming space. And I talk with Liz Davidson all the time, like wargaming does this a lot. Like there's a bunch of protest games. There's a bunch of Andean Abyss where it's like talking about, counterinsurgency and all that kind of stuff. There's a bunch of that. But to have this in the cooperative space is very exciting, which is why I'm doing a lot of coverage. Okay. So then do we finish off on like the kind of genesis of the game, or is there more?
Yeah, for sure. Oh, there's always more to say, but I've given you the summary. I've given you
right.
what I can relate. So yeah.
So I mean, I get the feeling that both of you have kind of been a part of movements. So maybe tell me about that personal aspect of it, like, because there seems to be a lot of personal touches in Block by Block.
For sure, yeah, and TL more so than me. TL is much more connected to political movements throughout their life. Yeah, I'll let TL tell their story another time. But my story is definitely like, I'm newer to this stuff, and that's been fun to grow and develop and become more politically aware in the 2000s, the 2010s, et cetera. I'd say for me, a big genesis of my own activism and connection, aside from my partner, who's definitely been a positive influence in my life in terms of getting me to care about issues and people and think things differently. In 2012, I moved to Chicago and I lived in a cooperatively organized house in Hyde Park. And so, this was home to a bunch of students and leftists and organizers and queer folks, and it was rad. It was such a good place. And that's where
who owns that? Who is there? Is it like by the grace of the owner that's like, okay, y'all can run stuff, or was there
no. So
ownership?
we all owned it together. It was
Wow.
it was a cooperative organized through NASCO. I'll give them a shout out, the National Association of Student Cooperatives. And basically everyone who lived there, when you paid rent, essentially you weren't paying to the landlord, you were paying into a communal pot. And as someone who lived there, you got to make decisions about the house. And so, there was like a stability in terms of like a governing structure and a bank account, so that if people came and went, the house would survive. But every week we had a consensus driven, democratic consensus meeting where we would sit there around the dinner table for, an hour to 3 hours and, propose motions.
These
and
meetings,
blocks
oh my
and
God.
make consensus. And yeah, it was like, it was good. It was hard, but it was definitely, that's when I think back on like my first sort of like actual visceral connection to organizing and to activism. It's living in that house with people and, realizing there were 13 of us. This was a big house and we all had different ideas about all kinds of stuff, from like as small as like barbecue sauce to like as big as like, should we, I don't know, go to this protest together? Anyway, we, I learned about how to like work with people and organize, and it was great. It was a really good time.
And so that, you said going to protest and going to that kind of stuff. I don't want to, you don't have to go through your whole history, but just kind of like give a sense, because it's not all the same, right? I mean, there's a whole texture to it, like you can, like I mentioned before, like, the environment movement is a different animal than the animal rights movement, and it's a different animal than, the city protests, people who are kind of quote unquote take back the city, local ownership and gardens. Like there's so much texture to, working for the people. So I wanted to kind of get a sense for the angle here, because that informs the game too,
For sure. Yeah. So that latter aspect you're talking about is much more connected to me. In addition to making board games, I like to make real world games where, you sort of go out on the street and experience the city in a playful way. And so this notion of like public space and people having power over space, as opposed to just corporations having power over space. So, the activism I've been involved with is sort of along those lines, and very bottom up, sort of grassroots. Around the 2016 election, some of my neighbors and I just organized together just a little mutual aid, a little affinity group where we were like, let's look out for each other. I was living in Philly at the time, and there was a big Proud Boys chapter in Philly, and we were worried about what they would do and how that would impact our neighbors. And so we didn't end up having to do anything. We didn't end up, taking action or getting into street fights or anything, but we organized, we met regularly. We said, let's be on the lookout, let's text each other, and, creating those sorts of very like small scale grassroots organizations where you and the people around you can trust each other and be able and ready to act together and respond to the scary things that are happening in our world is just like huge. And like, it seems small. It was like I would just go over to my friends, this was still in the pandemic, so we would like meet on their patio and space the deck chairs, 6 feet apart, and chat and like, have a beer through our masks, and it felt like nothing, but it was really building this kind of solidarity that's super important.
Okay, so we can get into that, the whole kind of take back. That's one of my personal things, right? When I was in college and kind of going forward, something I've never talked about at all on Shelf Stories, but I can finally do it. Okay, so this is going to get a little bit theoretical, but it doesn't make sense until you zoom the lens out and you question space ownership. Who owns the space? How do you enforce who owns the space? What a lot of folks know, and I live in the suburbs of Hartford, so if somebody's fence is like 5 inches into their perceived property line, then they're calling the police. You talk to the police, and like 50% of what they do is like navigate somebody's like ridiculous property claims. And like the idea of property itself, and the idea of like fenced in enclosure property, like we take that so for granted. It feels so natural. Oh, I bought this thing, it's mine, and you can't come on this space, and if you come on this space, then I'm calling the police. This idea that that's natural and that's the way it should be. And if it works for you, it works, right? If it works for you, it works. But if it doesn't work, then it doesn't. So like maybe tell the people it's about like what's wrong with that?
Yeah, this is a huge question. Greg, tell me about property.
What's wrong with the idea of what's wrong with that structure? Like why? Because this game, your philosophy questions that very structure of like 100%. Property and police and that kind of thing. But like, like at least kind of show us the red pill. Show it to us. You don't have to get through the whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the best gateway here, the quote that comes up, which is like intentionally provocative, and I won't sort of go into like digging into or defending too much, is Proudhon's "all property is theft," right? Which is like a classic anarchist jumping off point. And you can read more about that if you want. I'm not going to defend all that, but sure. It's good. It's a good conversation starter. But I think that, the problem and the way that Block by Block engages this question of space is not necessarily about like individual personal private property, right? Don't see this and hear me talk and say, oh man, those Block by Block designers, they want to take my house away and keep me from having a place to live. Like that's not the case. I own a house. I'm not like, trying to stop you from personally owning a house. But the problem becomes when this doctrine of property becomes expanded outward into corporations. This is a discourse I think a lot of people are aware of in terms of political speech with Citizens United, right? Corporations have an outsized influence on our elections. Similarly, they have an outsized influence on our space. The over privatization of the urban space is a problem as the state sort of like recedes and gives over things like, public transit or parking enforcement or, even like mall security, policing an area instead of the state kind of taking it over. And so suddenly all these spaces that were public that, you as a citizen, as a taxpayer, even as a citizen who doesn't pay taxes because you don't make enough money to pay taxes, like that space is yours. And suddenly now it's not. Now it belongs to a corporation and their security guards can kick you out if you're not, buying a latte at the Starbucks. This was a big thing that happened in Philly. Starbucks got a store in Love Park, and I don't actually know if it's still there or what. I moved out, so I'm not connected to the end of that story. So sorry for starting a story I can't finish, but that's kind of the theory here. And this is Block by Block simulates it a little bit as the people move through the city and take it back and say, this space is ours and should be ours. There's kind of a deeper way you can go to connect to this movement of indigenous peoples and give the land back and stuff like that. And that's not my expertise, so I'm not going to take it all the way there. But hopefully, I've given you the introduction. I've shown you the red pill, as you say.
Oh, I'll go there all the way there. We don't have to go.
That's great. I'm not going there because I don't want to. I'm not going there because I'm not an expert in that, and I'd be sort of getting out over my skis a little bit.
Well, look up Mount Rushmore, people. Well, I'll give you that. Look up Mount Rushmore. That does not belong to us, and it never belonged to us, and yet we put our 4 faces on there anyway. So And I think it's important because I think it enriches the experience of the game, right? Because there was a point in the playthrough, and where so if you picture the board, people, and I'm going to try to paint the mental picture here. And if you've already seen the playthrough, then that's fine. And if you don't know if the playthrough is on there, it's coming out very, very soon after this podcast comes out. So it should be, by the time you listen to it, there should be both. So there was a part where so you imagine a big 5x5 grid, and the starting zone is pretty forgiving. Like, I use the starting layout. The police are kind of off on the corners, and they make their way in as the game goes on. So like, I have pretty much free reign of like the upper right quadrant of the board. And what I decided to do in the playthrough was I kind of like staked out 4 areas, and I built barricades around those areas, right? And so then, the police are like, oh my God, there's a place, and they're kind of coming towards me, and the vans are coming in. Check out the playthrough for that. But the idea being that that space belongs to the people. And when we get into protest movements and we get into like the popular conception of them, then it's like all anarchy. Oh, they're just destroying stuff, and they're just what, like, go ahead and look up the Seattle Autonomous Zone that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, where it was literally people that just like, okay, police out, state artifice out, we're going to make our own laws. And it was actually like kind of peaceful and joyous. Like, people were barbecuing. You could kind of like walk in, and people worked stuff out, and you're going to have people come back and say, well, they destroyed a lot of property, they broke a lot of windows, blah, blah, blah. And, like, both things happened, right? But I don't want to lose the fact that there was they got together, they're trying to like develop the governing structure. And it was very much like, this isn't just us destroying stuff. It isn't just like making trouble for the sake of it. That's what a lot of people think activism is, making trouble. It's like, no. There already is trouble. Like, the state is already causing 100%. Trouble, and the trouble is for their benefit, not for our benefit. So like, okay, we like you said before, the privatization of spaces. We used to walk in a park and it was okay back in the day. Walk in a university back in the day. Walk in these public places, you would be whatever. Nowadays, now they're funneling you. Now it's like, okay, go here. Do it this way. Purchase, buy. And so it's like, not only did I conquer those 4 squares in my mind's eye, because I get the philosophy, I was creating an autonomous zone.
Totally. And I'm glad that that's the narrative you mapped onto it, because things like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone were exactly what we were thinking about, of like these experiments. There was some problematic stuff in the Capitol Hill zone, but there's plenty of problematic stuff in our, current governed reality. And so it's like,
right,
let's try something different and see what happens. And, we're not living in a utopia right now. So,
so, I mean, this isn't, you're not playing the barbarians, conquering stuff. Like, you are like, the game can't do that in and of itself. Like, it can't like make governing structures, and it can't make all these things, but at least it nudges you in that direction. And I really wanted to put a podcast together to kind of map the philosophy on this game, because it's doing a lot of stuff. Tiffany Lay also is going to do a preview, and they did a blog previously that talked a lot about this philosophy stuff too. So I'm going to go ahead and link that and link their coverage so that we
it was a great piece, and partly inspired by Tiffany's work, and just by our own, like, we like the abstraction of block by block. We like that it gives you a hook and lets you sort of interpret the game for yourself. But we worked with Margaret Killjoy, who's a fiction author, who's published some stuff through AK Press, who's supporting the distribution of the game. And all the liberation cards, when you liberate, you saw this in the playthrough, you flip the tile over, you pull out a card. In previous editions, they just had a little bonus. Now there's a little narrative, and that narrative gives you a choice, and then there's a mechanical ramification for each of these 2 choices. And so those narratives were part of how we wanted to bring that kind of spirit of liberation to that moment. They're all about these joyful moments of, we're all going to share food together, we're going to have a party in the street, there's a band playing, and it's like, yeah, we've taken this space that was a space of, repression, capitalist taking, and now suddenly it's a space for dancing. And that's just like, if there's something at the core of it for me, like, that's just really a big part of it, of like, can we just like live a good life together? Mm-hmm. Maybe, in the ruins of the bad life we had before.
In the capitalist mindset, it's all taking. Like, someone has to own it, either me or you. And it's a scarcity mindset. It's like, there's only so much stuff to go around. and therefore we need these structures and we need bosses to manage the limited stuff. And in this mindset, it's not limited stuff. This is the scarcity is manufactured.
100%.
So it's like we have enough food to feed the entire world, like, many times over. We actually destroy food. If you really get into it, like farmers destroy food. Like if they can't sell it at market, they're destroying. Meanwhile, people are starving. So it's like, this scarcity is manufactured to justify their ownership. And what the idea is, it's like, okay, it's not scarce, it's plentiful. If you trust people, they will make, they will contribute, they will share. We're not just going to sit on the couch doing drugs and play video games all day. So it really does, like, you have to have kind of an optimistic view of human people.
Yes, totally.
And that's what you.
But once you have that, it's like, yeah, you can, anything, another world is possible, as they say.
Yeah. So then, in terms of the police, talk specifically about the game's philosophy about police, because that's touchy. It is. We could 100%. Talk in this abstract way about property and people kind of like jibe or don't jibe with it. When it comes to police, I think people have like a visceral, like, we need these people. Why are they the enemy? We need these people. I know there's some bad apples that do some bad things, but like, we need police. And there's when you have a game in a middle-class hobby like this, and this is a middle-class hobby,
100%.
A lot of us own property. If we're backing, we're on what Game Found, but if we're on crowdfunding, then chances are we're above the median wage, and the higher you go, the more you kind of like the police. So then talk a little bit about how the game translates and navigates that dynamic.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the sort of like specifics of, the inherent structural problems with policing are not really present in the game. Although, we're happy to go into those. But in the game, it's exactly that power dynamic, that sort of capitalist structure that is represented, that, right, the people who have the money, who have the power, are being protected by the police. And so in the game, that's the function the police serve, as this sort of agent of the state. They start in the state districts, the financial district, the airport, the city hall. It's not called the city hall, I'm blanking on the name now, but they're these hubs of power. And a lot of the cards in the game, I don't think we drew any of them in our playthrough, but a lot of the cards in the game will direct you to take those hubs of state power, because that's how, movements of the people express their dissent. They say, the Hong Kong protests took the airport, and they said, flights are not going in or out until we get our demands met. Mm-hmm. And so the police defend these things, and that's pretty much the function they serve in Block by Block. We have this system of police ID numbers that, the higher value districts, the privatized university, the gentrifying zone, the police are more likely to go to those places because that's where the people with money are. And so that's where the police will show up, because there's not this sort of neutral force.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And did that, because you've play tested this and this game has been released, do people engage with that? Or is it like, okay, this is a fun game? Or have you had comments about people saying, okay, I feel a bit uncomfortable about this, or is it just people just kind of move past it and play the game?
There's definitely both. There's definitely, as TL says, if we weren't getting some trolls, we wouldn't be doing our job. But there's space between like antagonistic trolling. I think the second edition has a 1-star, one of my favorite 1-star reviews on BGG, which says 1 star, Antifa, the board game, which is like, I'm anti-fascist. If you think that's a problem, maybe there's something you need to interrogate within yourself. But so anyway, there's a space between antagonism and full embrace. A lot of the people who play Block by Block are people who already are convinced of its political message. So, there's not, these are people who've been on the street, who've clashed with police, who understand what the game is saying. But there's definitely a middle space, and a lot of the people I've played the game with are in this space where it's like, this is like a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And so in that way, the fact that it's a game, the fact that it's very abstracted is I don't want to say useful, that sounds too mercenary, but like getting someone to a place where they're a little bit uncomfortable and can start engaging with a new idea, but not so uncomfortable that they become defensive, is very hard. And that's like, that's a key tactic of persuasion, is like, how do you find that space? And I'm somewhat skeptical about the ability of games to persuade people of big things, but it's been fun to play the game with people who say, Greg, I trust you to pull out a fun game and we'll have a good time. And even though this is like, maybe I wouldn't personally, get in the street and build some barricades, but it's fun to do it in a board game. And maybe that'll open my mind the next time I see protest coverage on the TV.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's actually drill down on that. Say more, like the ability of games to persuade.
So this is a huge topic. Do you know this about me? I don't know if you know this about me or your listeners. I'm a PhD candidate in a communications and media studies program studying analog games and their digital adaptations.
Wow.
So I'll try not to like give you the whole dissertation. But when you say talk about how games persuade, that's just like there's so much literature for me to think through and dig into. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. It's a good question. I don't like.
I guess
I'm getting a PhD, so I don't talk about it too much. But,
right. I mean, because you mentioned, you kind of like threw out there that you feel like it's limited.
Yeah, totally. Right. I think people tend to be too optimistic about what games can do, and that's in part because those of us in the gaming scene, whether that's people who study them or make them, have a material incentive to believe that games can do big things because we're devoting our lives to them. So that's cool, and I understand that, and I'm not trying to yuck anybody's yum or whatever, and I'll hear a good argument. But generally I think if I play I don't know Puerto Rico, that's not going to convince me that colonialism is good. I'm going to play the game and be like, wow, that, there was some problematic stuff there, but good core mechanics, great, bye, I'm not thinking about it anymore. And so it would be dishonest of me to expect block by block to work differently, to say someone who is not on board with protest movements to say, wow, I hated those protesters until I played block by block and now I'm ready to get in the street. It's like that. I don't know.
Right.
It's too big of an ask, especially, there are like games that are designed for education or like, with convincing people and persuading people in mind. Maybe those work better. I don't know. But like hobby board games, like the ones you and I love to play, are primarily entertainment media. And so they can only be as persuasive as entertainment media generally can, which I think is not very.
So obviously I'm in the space, right? I'm in the space of critiquing games, wanting games to be better arguments, wanting games to be better. I think
100%.
that, so they can't, you're right. It's a big topic, but I think where I ultimately land is that games can do harm.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm not trying to say games shouldn't do better. I'm just saying, I think there's a cap on what they can do. I'm 100% with you on like, games should do better. We should be critical about games. We should think about the representations and systems we're asking people to engage with. But I think the end goal of that is exactly what you're saying, is harm reduction, is opening up the space for people to have fun, and is not, pushing people to believe new things. Like we can push people to believe new things in our conversations about block by block afterwards when we're, eating snacks and talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, and the harm that games do, it's not like you said before, I'm not going to play Puerto Rico and like all of a sudden love a colonizer. Like, it basically, the harm that games do is that it can press existing wounds.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Right. So then, by putting a stereotypical something in a game of or depiction of women, right? If I do the 100th boobylicious woman, sex object or whatever it is, scantily clad, walking into a dungeon or whatever it is. So like you're reinforcing a very, very old and ingrained vision of a woman in society that they're a sex object.
100%.
And men don't know that because that's not how we're seen. But a woman, ask any woman who's walked into a game store, there's always going to be a couple of people leering at them. It's like, ooh, can I date this person? Or can I talk to this person? So then when a game reproduces that can kind of create the harm.
100%. And
so then
when I say, oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, just to finish off that thought, I think because, or maybe one of the reasons why we're so optimistic about games is because we've seen the opposite. Like we've seen how much harm they can do. So it's like, if they can do this terrible thing, if they can bring out the worst in us, the most competitive, the most stereotypical, the most whatever, then we can the opposite be true? Can we do these wonderful things with games and teach people, X, Y, Z? And what you're saying is not quite. Doesn't quite work both ways.
Yeah, I may be a little too pessimistic about it, but yeah, I do think like the harms of sexist depictions, racist depictions, engagements with colonialism are not like, it's the games are the proximate cause of that harm, but the ultimate cause of that harm is the underlying social system, which is, why I ultimately ended up getting involved in activism and games like Block by Block, because I don't think you can change all the board games you want, but you have to change the underlying social system. I would rather a world where those harms and those narratives don't exist and all the board games are kind of lackluster, versus a game where all the board games have perfect politics and racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., are still oppressing people.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that may be a separate discussion when your PhD is ready. So actually, where are you in the PhD process?
So I am very close. It feels like I'm so far away, but I'm very close to being done. I'm scheduled to defend in June.
Wow.
So I'm writing, I'm wrapping up data collection. But actually I'm talking about all this like social stuff. My PhD is mostly about media and digital media versus analog media. I'm watching people play games in person and online and comparing and contrasting. So I'm working on bringing a critical element to it because I care about that, but my primary arguments are going to be pretty dry, pretty media focused.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, games are media, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
this is one of the things, and I think we're one of the things Shelf Stories does, and we want to like raise a discourse around games. Like, I mean, with so much of how we talk about games, like, oh, it's just games. Oh, it's just a game. Let it go.
It's such a loaded dismissal, man. There's so much in there.
I want to keep my comfort in place.
Yep.
I want to stay in the land of the blue pill. I know I'm making a lot of Matrix references. So if you haven't seen the Matrix, I'm sorry. There's a whole new Matrix. Go ahead and watch that. So it's not.
And it does good work to reclaim the sort of like red pill discourse from the the manosphere who sort of corrupted that phrase. So I like that.
I don't know. Actually, I don't know about that. What is that?
Oh my gosh, this is a whole.
So this is the end of the podcast, people. I'll do like this will be the wrap up, but like
that's great.
If you don't want to hear like us go down a rabbit hole of stuff, you're good. Block by block, game found. What's the date of the game found project?
Yeah, we're launching on February 15th, but the preview page is live now. If you want to follow there, we've got people following it to get notifications, and also Game Found is a new platform for a lot of people, so go ahead and make your login and get yourself set up so you don't miss it when it drops. But you can go to outofordergames.com, out of order, just like you think, and we've got a little link there to the preview page, so that's where to find Block by Block.
All right, so this podcast released on the 13th, so it'll be very, very soon. And the video that I keep on mentioning is going to be on the thing as well. We're going to have, I really want this project to succeed because I think it's a really fun game, really fun statement. Even if games can't handle complex arguments about property and people and all kind of stuff, at least this game points you in the right direction, and listen to the right people, they'll be able to articulate the philosophy. So if this game does that, then I'm happy. So that's all the promo. If you don't want to hear some articulation about the red pill, because I'm very interested, you're good. But I want to hear it. What is the discourse that you're talking about in terms of that like change that happened?
So I don't know when this happened. I'm not a historian of this, although I guess I should give a shout out to what made me think about this, which is the Bechdel Cast, which is a movie podcast about intersectional feminism. And they had Emily Vanderwerf, who I think is changing her last name. Anyway, a really great trans film writer who was talking about why she loves The Matrix so much, even though it's kind of been adopted by questionable folks. But so part of this discussion was how it has been adopted. And I guess the phrase taking the red pill has been adopted by like men's rights advocates to mean like when you understand that society is actually biased towards women against men, and your mind opens and you're like, it's all a trick. The feminists are out to get us. And so for a while, I guess, like between the original Matrix trilogy and the new fourth Matrix movie, this was like the dominant use of the phrase red pill online.
I had no idea. I was just going off the movie. I know
that's a good sign. That means you're not like terminally online like I am. So
okay,
that's good. But the new movie reacts to this, like it knows that this is what the red pill has been meaning, and takes big steps to kind of reject that interpretation. So I'm all for reclaiming the term red pill.
No, wow. Now I have to totally get into this discourse. Okay,
don't go too deep. It gets real bad real quick.
So I want Greg to come back on after he has defended his dissertation, not before. because that's going to be a whole big thing. You're probably going to have
and I got to spend all my time working on it.
All the time working on, all the time preparing. I don't want to like, jut in something that's like, okay, after you defend, after they, they come up and they shake your hand, they're like, okay, all that stuff, and you're able to kind of relax and do it. Please come on back on the show and talk about some of the greater media coverage and what games can do, what games can't do, and all that. All games, not just Block, but like all games. I'm assuming you're looking at like a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah. I'm casting a pretty wide net, including like role-playing games and LCG, CCG type games. So yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much for the invite. I would love to do that.
I can't wait. It sounds exciting.
I can't wait either, because it means I'll be done with my process and I'll be out of the graduate school world. So
I'm going to set a notification in July.
Please,
please. Right? July, is that the good time?
That'll keep me on track. I'm supposed to defend in June, and there's always temptations to delay, but knowing that you've got a calendar invite in July would be like, okay, push forward, get done.
Greg Loring-Albright, this was amazing. Block by Block is on GameFi. We already gave the promo, but one more time, back this project. It is really fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us. I just want to say it's been great chatting with you, and I love your vibe. I love following you on Twitter. Just like a really thoughtful, encouraging, powerful voice for board game Twitter. So I know you're elsewhere and you're a real person, not just on Twitter, but whenever I see your tweets crossing my feed, it's a good day. So
I try, I try to be positive. I try to be constructive, and that's another thing. Good. It's like, I have an online presence and I'm crafting it specifically to kind of offer a vision of activism that isn't like yelly and deconstructive. Because that's the stereotype. Like, and it could be the most beautiful tweet in the world that's like, totally right about like criticisms and defunding and all that stuff. But it's like that kind of tweet will always get read as, oh, they want to take stuff away from me, or they want to tear away. I want to resist that as much as possible. And then people accuse me of rabble-rousing anyway. But I really try to be as constructive as possible. So I really appreciate the compliment. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me on.